Good evening, friends. On behalf of Kerala Society of Ophthalmic Surgeons, I place on records my sincere gratitude to Vitreoretinal Society of India for conducting this session during Drishti 2020 virtual. This session is designed in such a way that it is very useful for general ophthalmologist and comprehensive ophthalmologist. We have esteemed faculty. Dr. Shobit Chawla is President of Vitreoretinal Society of India. Dr. Raja Narayanan from L.V. Prasad Institute. He is the Honorary General Secretary of Vitreoretinal Society of India. Dr. Anand Rajendran from Aravind Eye Care System, Chennai. He is the Scientific Committee Chairperson of Vitreoretinal Society of India. Then we have faculty, Dr. Chaitra Jaydev from Narayan Nethralaya, Bangalore, Dr. Prashant Bhawankule from Nagpur, and Dr. Manisha Agarwal from Delhi. All of them are going to deliver talks which are very simple and useful for general ophthalmologists. Over to you. I am handing over the session to Vitreoretinal Society of India. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank KOS for inviting VRSI to conduct this symposium. So let's get ahead with do's and don'ts after nucleus drop, staying calm and managing the situation. So what not to do? Fishing in the vitreous is a complete no, as it leads to endothelial damage, vitreous hemorrhage, retinal breaks, and even detachment. PCR occurs in approximately 1% of phacoemulsification cases. Cases who have this complication can develop pain, corneal edema, exaggerated or prolonged intraocular inflammation, secondary glaucoma, CME, and retinal detachment. The management of retained intraocular lens fragment plays a great role in determining the final visual acuity. A simple PCR without a vitreous loss can be concluded like a routine procedure. A large PCR with fragments anteriorly can be managed by anterior vitrectomy and pars plana needle levitation of fragments and phacoemulsification. Once lens matter is in the vitreous or it is a complete nucleus drop, it has to be a complete vitrectomy with posterior hyaloid removal like in any traumatized eye. Don't panic, stay calm. PCR is not a crime. Avoid over manipulation in anterior chamber because that increases risk of damage to endothelial and post-op inflammation. There have been a lot of articles and papers about when to intervene after lens drop. A notable one is based on the histopathological features of vitreous specimens after pars plana vitrectomy for retained lens material. And then these features have been correlated with time. It has been best seen that no inflammatory cells were found when PPV was performed within 3 days. Inflammatory cells occurred more over time from 4 to 7 days and then going ahead. In a VR setup, surgeon available, immediate retrieval of lens fragment with pars plana approach. If surgeon is not available, a bimanual anterior vitrectomy to remove vitreous prolapsing into anterior chamber without any further damage to posterior capsule. Round pupil relieves vitreous traction and decreases incidence of post-operative CME and RD. If there is anterior capsular support which is adequate, we can do a sulcus implantation, inadequate anterior chamber IOL, or even scleral fixation may be done, which may be done as a primary procedure or as a secondary procedure after a few days. So, in nutshell, it's as soon as possible to achieve a good final visual acuity. This has been seen by a study by Prithvi Mrutyunjay et al. And also by a Duke Eye Center study. We routinely follow the immediate approach, but because that entails that the patient can avoid undergoing two surgeries and the associated risk of anesthesia, and delayed removal of retained lens figure can become challenging if corneal edema occurs. So proper management of lens fragment begins at the time of capsular rupture with a complete vitreous removal from the anterior chamber to ensure there is no problem. Very small amounts of lens fragments, cortical material may get absorbed and may not require surgery. And patient can be followed up on topical anti-inflammatory drops. A pars plana approach is always safer as compared to an anterior chamber approach. Nowadays, we do a lot of hybrid vitrectomy where two ports are either 23 or 25 gauge, and the fragmentome port can be 23 gauge or 20 gauge. So this is a case of spontaneous drop in a patient which required a complete removal. This patient had a small pupil, was undergoing cataract surgery, but at the very commencement of surgery, there was a drop and a complete removal had to be done. In such cases, a unimanual fragmentome can be used, or you can have a setup for chopping in the posterior segment if the whole situation necessitates that and the nucleus is hard. A good removal of posterior hyaloid always helps in these cases and stabilizes the eye for a long term. Then the lens can be implanted. Example of hybrid vitrectomy in the same way. So these cases can vary in their need and some can be done just with the cutter and crushing with the lens. Other hard lenses may require fragmentome. Another approach for very hard nucleus is the bimanual posterior segment phaco for hard cataract. As I said, the simpler cases can be managed by just crushing with the light pipe, but some cases may require for bimanual surgery with chandelier illumination. Here the fragmentome is used as a stabilizing, after a good vitrectomy, the fragmentome is used as a stabilizing mechanism, while an irrigating chopper or a regular chopper, as the need may be, is used for doing similar chopping as is done in the anterior segment. chopped segments can be further chopped and then emulsified easily. It's a good reproducible technique, but requires a lot of care so as not to injure any blood vessel or the retina around. We have followed this technique in such situations for a very long time with very consistent results. You have to ensure a good round pupil and a good uneventful result in the end. So in the end, some reflections, retained lens material is frequently a two-surgeon situation requiring expertise, cooperation, communication between cataract and VR surgeon. When a dropped lens is encountered, IOL placement should be attempted by anterior segment surgeon if sulcus is stable. All larger wounds should be sutured to prevent hypotony and reduce complications. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Good evening. On behalf of the Vitreous Society of India, I'd like to thank the organizers of KSOS, Mahesh Gopalakrishnan, especially for inviting us and having us here. This wonderful, elaborate virtual online meet. So it's going to be my pleasure to talk to you today about the management of diabetic macular edema, the principles and paradigms involved. So we'll begin with a quick look at the pathogenesis of DME, diabetes, and hyperglycemia. It uses, as we know, a bunch of biochemical and molecular pathways. It uses a number of cytokines and chemokines, vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, primary amongst them. This helps alteration of the blood-retinal barrier, increases vascular permeability, and leads on to the DME. Now, the management of DME has moved from the erstwhile laser photocoagulation of the 80s through the turn of the millennium, where intravitreal steroids are ushered in a new era of pharmacotherapy. To this current era, where anti-VEGF triumvirate, bevacizumab, ranibizumab, aflibercept holds sway. Now, the approach we're going to take is to look at the current basic principles guiding DME treatment, look at the factors to assess that will help us decide how to strike, and a quick look at the future directions. So, the guiding principles learned from the trials. Resolve showed us that anti-VEGF agent ranibizumab showed high efficacy over sham, as seen in the equity plot. DRCR gives a bunch of information. Protocol I, where it gives a number of important clinical teaching points. Ranibizumab laser combination is better than the erstwhile standards laser or ITA laser, and the deferring combination laser is better than prompt laser, as seen in this two-way equity plot, where the ranibizumab deferred laser was found to be superior to prompt laser, and of course the two combination are way better than laser only or IPT prompt laser. And this equity advantage for deferred laser was seen at 3 years as well as at 5 years, and in terms of macular edema also deferred laser was better. Early intense treatment, reduced treatment burden later. So suspicions were confirmed here, and the protocol I combination arms, as you can see, in first year 89 injections, and subsequently, the number of injections dramatically reduced to 2 and 1 and 3 and 2, suggesting that if we get a grip on the disease early enough through aggressive treatment, we can reduce the number of injections subsequently. And up to 43% of patients didn't really require ranibizumab treatment in year 3. Higher safety issues were noted for IVTA in terms of elevated intraocular pressure glaucoma, as well as cataract genesis. Over half the patients needing cataracts surgery after 2 weeks. In the RISE and RIDE study shows us something very important. In untreated eyes, it's never too late for instituting anti-VEGF treatment. Very often you get patients with thickened maculae, with photographs say a year back or 6 months back, and you wonder whether putting in treatment will help. So this trial clearly showed that definitely it's important to do so. And as you can see in the graph here, the ranibizumab arms, they just shoot off, whereas the no treatment hardly gets off the baseline. And the moment these patients are allowed ranibizumab treatment, that graph slowly starts snaking up. Likewise, the macular edema, once these patients after a year were allowed subject treatment, magically the macula start drying up and almost catches up with the arms. Same thing was also noted in laser-only eyes. Again, it's never too late for anti-VEGF treatment. Also, they showed that counterintuitively, Adding laser didn't seem to reduce the ranibizumab retreatment rates, which was supposed to be the USP of laser. So as the graph shows, the ranibizumab take off straight away. The laser only on the blue line hardly gets off the floor. The moment after a year, they allowed ranibizumab treatment. The graph starts snaking up, and up to the point where at 3 years, it almost catches up with the laser ranibizumab combination. So the corollary to this is it doesn't seem to make a difference whether you add ranibizumab to the laser at the start or 1 year down the line. At the 3-year time point, you're almost in the same place. And the extension study shows that the number of injections retreatment was the same, and adding laser didn't seem to reduce that, the number of D-injections. The BOLD study showed a high efficacy of bevacizumab for DME, Vistalivir a high efficacy of eflornithine for DME. DRCR protocol T showed us something very important, and it compared the 3 anti-VEGF agents for DME and gave us 2 important learning points. Higher efficacy for eflornithine and ranibizumab over bevacizumab in poor vision patient, which is less than equal to 20/50. Eflornithine being marginally better than ranibizumab. Bevacizumab reduced macular thickness the least of the 3. The anti-VEGF regimens used for monthly dosing, PRN, and the more recent one, treat and extend. PRN dosing very strict equity and OCT-based treatment criteria. The RETAIN study was the first single masked RCT using treat and extend compared to PRN, and found that Trex was not better or was comparable to PRN. The Vivadex study showed us something very important: head-to-head comparison of Ozurdex and bevacizumab showed that bevacizumab overall is better than Ozurdex, but when you look at pseudophakic only eyes, they were almost the same, similar. Whereas with macular edema reduction showed something very interesting. While at the end of 2 years, both end up at the same point, Ozurdex helps reduce that macular edema fast and more quickly early on. A few factors to guide the clinician. So one needs to look at the clinical profile, the fundus picture, the OCT FFA pictures, best guide equity of that eye. One needs to look at the fellow eye status, the systemic profile, rule out masqueraders. One should also look at and understand the dosing history, posology, whether the drug use was appropriate, whether the dosing strategy was adequate. In India, one needs to look very carefully at patient factors too, compliance, financial issues. So the clinical profile, I have divided these clinical factors into, the mitigating factors and what I call the encouraging factors. Mitigating factors may not be degeneration, macular atrophy, thinning, subfoveal fibrosis, macular ischemia, poor vision, which for me is less than equal to 3/60, loss of ISOS integrity, chronic factors, outer retinal tubulations, frill, disorganized retinal inner layers, and the surgical factors, epiretinal membrane, intraocular refraction. These are that you would desist from a very aggressive treatment injection policy. Whereas with encouraging factors, pure clean edema with or without subretinal fluid, as in this picture here, suboptimal vision, which again for me is about 6/18 to 4/60, one can pursue an aggressive treatment regimen. Examples of mitigating factors being macular ischemia, subfoveal fibrosis, macular exudates, outer retinal tubulations, macular atrophy, drill, surgical factors like EMT and epiretinal membranes. So in short, to look at the fellow eye, like I said, if it has good vision, it desist from an aggressive treatment injection policy. It's one eye, you can pursue it. Systemic factors need to be known. The glitazones can induce edema. Aggravating factors like nephropathy, hypertension, anemia need to be ruled out. Look for history of stroke, myocardial infarctions, allergies. One needs to importantly rule out masqueraders like hypertension, MACTEL, like retinoschisis. So a management mantra would be monthly anti-VEGF injections until the patient is stable, basically equity OCT unchanged for 2 or 3 visits. And then if the mitigating factors are there, wait and extend up to 2 months, or if the encouraging factors are there, as I mentioned, treat and extend, inject and extend up to 2 months. And then if the patient in either category is stable, we can extend follow-up up to 3 months. If it is unstable, we go back to treat and extend. That basically the dosing is inadequate. If it's adequate, and you still have refractory DME, you can switch it, or Avastin patients to Axentrix and vice versa. An example of patients refractory to Avastin benefited from Axentrix, and the converse, though rare, has also been shown true. So a number of studies have shown the same thing, that switching an anti-VEGF agent helps. So ranibizumab for Avastin treated patients or aflibercept helps. So elderly pseudophakics, IVT or Ozurdex can be used. Ozurdex, especially for vitrectomized eyes, where Boyer showed that Ozurdex, this is one place where there's no other drug which can work just as well as Ozurdex in vitrectomized eye, because pharmacokinetics are maintained. The MEAT study also showed that dexamethasone was useful for refractory patients previously treated laser anti-VEGF. The question about combining anti-VEGF and steroids, this was inclusively answered by DRCA protocol U, which showed that adding dexamethasone to ranibizumab offered no significant equity advantage. So Helen and Wang also showed that adding IVTA to Avastin offered no advantage. There are additional benefits to be had for repeated anti-VEGF treatment because they seem to retard the background diabetic retinopathy progression, as a number of studies have shown. So diffuse DME, you can use combination treatment. IVT can be considered in pseudophakics. Combining deferred lasers better. Standalone lasers good for non-center involving DME. Surgical factors like epiretinal membrane, vitreomacular fraction, dealt with vitrectomy. Rule out the masculators, that's important. Newer laser systems, yellow laser is coming in. The duty cycle of 5% is preferred. Contiguous treatment, sweep the maculae. There's less RP damage as shown on autofluorescent microperimetry. Intravitreal faciline is row-associated protein kinase inhibitor for DME. Fluocinolone or Iluvien is a kind of steroid which sustained drug delivery through a 25-gauge intravitreal injection system. It's non-biodegradable of a cylindrical tube. A slow FA release of zero autokinetic lasts 2 to 3 years, and Kaposia has shown great results. So a summary of what we've been talking about right now. Other alternatives would be injecting at increased frequency 2 to 3 weeks, dose high drug cocktail, drug holiday, limited vitrectomy without island living. All these have been shown to have benefits, but not very consistent. So with that, I will stop now. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Hello, everyone. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk on common mistakes and pearls in OCT interpretation and injections. Broadly, I'll be covering the topics of the common retinal diseases of CNVM and diabetic macular edema. Before one starts diagnosing retinal diseases or starts treating medical retina patients with injections, one should know the layers of the retina on OCT very well so that you can be the master of the OCT machine. I'm not going to talk in detail about the different layers of the retina, but knowing each and every layer helps in the correct diagnosis as well as in prognosticating the patients in terms of what's going to be the likely outcome after a series of injections. So what is the importance of etiological classification of CNVM? CNVM by itself is not a disease, it's just a sign. There can be many diseases which can be associated with CNVM. Like you can see here on this slide, so many different retinal diseases, right from choroidal osteoma to high myopia to injured streaks or inflammation can be associated with CNVM apart from macular degeneration. So it's important to know the underlying pathology. Sometimes you need to treat them. Sometimes they can point to a serious life-threatening or a systemic disorder, which you would probably like to treat and not just the CNVM. And also it helps us to prognosticate in terms of the number of injections and the improvement in vision. Not every CNVM needs multiple injections every year, unlike ARMD. So what are the types of CNVM based on OCT, which is like histopathology? The important landmark in classifying CNVMs on OCT is the RPE line. If the CNVM is below the RPE, as in this case, you can see most of the CNVM is under the RPE, it's called a type 1 CNVM. Now, type 1 CNVMs are generally associated with macular degeneration or CSR, and you should know that these kind of CNVMs, whatever drugs you inject inside the eye, they do not penetrate the RPE and have as much efficacy compared to those CNVMs which are above the RPE. So CNVMs above the RPE are likely to regress faster and have a better visual outcome if you treat them appropriately. What about type 2 CNVM? As you can see here, the CNVM is above the RPE line. You can see a lot of subretinal fluid. These are diseases which probably need lesser injections than type 1 CNVMs under the RP, because drugs which we inject inside the eye, different molecules, they have an easier access to CNVM above the RPE. And there is another type which is not a CNVM exactly, but an form of macular degeneration which we describe as type 3 neovascularization, which is the RAP lesion or retinal angiomatous proliferation, which starts intraretinally and then can proceed subretinally and even under the RPE. So just in brief, occult versus classic CNVM, while occult is, and classic are classifications based on FA, you can correlate them with the OCT. Occult CNVMs are usually under the RPE or type 1 CNVMs, and classic CNVMs are usually above the RPE, what you call as type 2 CNVM. And I've listed the different causes of these CNVMs. And most importantly, type 1 CNVM, they progress slow. Macular degeneration associated CNVM or a CSR associated CNVM, they usually progress slow, but they also respond slow, which means you have to keep giving a lot of injections and the fluid doesn't go away easily with injections. Whereas type 2 CNVMs can progress very rapidly, like myopic CNVM, but they also resolve fast if you give the appropriate number of injections early on. Not every hyporeflective space on OCT is fluid. As in this case, you can see well demarcated high reflective border and a circular lesion, and within that lesion is the hyporeflective area. These are called outer retinal tubulations. They're not to be misinterpreted as subretinal fluid or intraretinal fluid. These are attempts by the photoreceptors to regenerate, usually occur in late stages of CNVM, and it's not necessary to treat them with anti-VEGF injections. What about subretinal scar? We tend to see quite a few patients who have been receiving injections for subretinal scar. As you can see here, there's no need to treat subretinal scar without any fluid with anti-VEGF injections. What do we tell a patient, especially of macular degeneration, if you give them injections? What's going to be the outcome in terms of number of injections or even the visual acuity gain? The CAT trial was designed to look at ranibizumab versus bevacizumab monthly or PRN. And as you can see here, the difference between bevacizumab PRN or ranibizumab monthly was less than 4 letters. In general, they have a similar outcome. They were non-inferior, but if you look at the fluid drying capacity, ranibizumab had a better reduction in fluid compared to bevacizumab. There are some cases which can masquerade like CNVM, like in this 42-year-old gentleman who had a pigmented scar in the right eye, and the left eye had a subretinal yellowish lesion right under the macula. And this gentleman had received 2 injections elsewhere, and he came to us for another opinion. And what we looked at in the right eye, this kind of pigmentation is not typical of macular degeneration. And the left eye lesion also was not looking like a CNVM, especially when we repeated the OCT. You can see the pigment epithelium is relatively intact, and there is a lot of subretinal hyperreflectivity, which could be due to fibrin deposition. And when we did the fluorescein in this patient, showed a typical CSR leak. So it's important to not forget the role of fluorescein angiography even now at this time when we have OCT angiography. We did navigating laser in this patient to the leak, and without any further injections, the fibrin material resolved. You can see the pre-laser and post-laser OCT, quite a dramatic difference. Switching to diabetic macular edema, the DRCR protocols have guided us in terms of practical applications, how to prognosticate patients and how to differentiate between the different anti-VEGF molecules in DME. Protocol I was one of the most useful protocols for diabetic macular edema, comparing ranibizumab with prompt deferred laser and also intravitreal triamcinolone. We won't talk about triamcinolone here, but if you look at the overall 5-year follow-up, the most important point to know is that patients have about 7 to 10 liters of gain in vision on average. So that's an important thing which we have to tell our patients what to expect after all these injections. Will they become 6'6"? Will they be having 6'12"? It all depends on where they start off. On average, they will have 7 to 10 liters of gain. But there is a difference in the outcomes if the baseline vision is good, that is better than 20/50. These patients tend to have only one line of gain, whereas patients who have vision less than 20/40, about 618 or worse, they tend to have much more improvement, like almost 18 to 20 letters, as you can see here. And that too, deferred laser patients did better than patients who underwent prompt macular laser. So at this point of time, at least in center involving DME, we are not using macular laser as often as we used to before the advent of anti-VEGF injections. What about the different types of injections? Do they have any difference? Aflibercept or Eylea, bevacizumab or Avastin, ranibizumab or Lucentis, Accentrix. So Protocol T compared them head to head. And again, patients who had less than 20/50 vision, their aflibercept or Eylea had the highest improvement in vision compared to Avastin or Lucentis, although Lucentis or ranibizumab was quite similar to aflibercept. This is in patients who have vision 20/50 or less at baseline, that is about 618 or less. What about patients who had vision 20/50 or better, 618 or so or better? These patients did not have much of a difference whichever anti-VEGF agents we used. But definitely in terms of OCT outcomes, aflibercept had the highest drying capacity compared to the other two injections. So what's the practical reality at this point of time? VRSI did a survey this year and asked the retina specialists after how many injections would they switch from one injection to another, and typically 2 to 3 injections is what we would look at before switching the patients to another injection. And usually the switch would not be to another anti-VEGF, but rather to steroid such as dexamethasone implant or Ozurdex. What about patients who have good vision at baseline with center involving macular edema? So we know that if the macular edema is not involving the foveal center, we tend to manage them either with laser or observation. But what about patients who have center involving macular edema, but the vision is good? So protocol, we looked at this and found that observation or injection or laser were quite similar. So you can tend to observe these patients and they did not have much of a significant difference in outcome. What I would like to show in the end is that we should all be retina specialists in terms of good clinicians rather than tend to treat only the OCT. You cannot treat as a doctor a CT scan or an ultrasound. You have to have sound clinical experience to make decisions because sometimes OCT can be misguiding. Like in this patient who was referred to me with macular edema and was advised injection. In fact, this patient came for another opinion. And when I looked at this patient carefully with the 90D, I could not find any reason for macular edema. I could not see any hemorrhages, any inflammation. So the first thing you need to question is this the correct diagnosis or what is the reason for this macular edema? And when we repeat those CT, we found a macular hole. So you must look at all the scans on the OCT and not just one scan which the patient is carrying as a printout, because it may not be going through the center of the pathology. So this is actually a surgical disease rather than a medical disease. Imagine what would have happened with injection in this kind of patient. The hole would have still persisted. So a good clinician would look at all the scans, correlate with fundus examination, and repeat fundus examination when in doubt. So you should rely more on clinical skills than just tests alone. I'm showing an example here of intravitreal injections which need to be given extremely carefully not anyone, especially those who are not trained, should not be giving injections. It can be risky, even if you are a good cataract surgeon. So here, cataract surgeons tend to give the injection more parallel to the pupil and are more likely to touch the lens or even give the injection inside the lens. As you can see here, this is an Ozurdex injection which is being given, injected now. It went accidentally into the lens, and then the photoemulsification is starting. The surgeon had not realized for a long time that the Ozurdex was intralenticular, and the Ozurdex has been emulsified along with the lens. So you must get trained before you inject. So in conclusion, control the urge for injection. The most common mistake is clinical evaluation and interpretation, and do not harm the patient. Thank you for your kind attention.
Hi, everybody. I thank KSOS for this opportunity, and I'm glad to be part of the VRSI session. Today, I'll be speaking on the optimal use of FFA and ICG in a retina practice. I have no financial disclosures. The earliest reports of photographing fluorescence in circulating blood in the human retina was in way back in 1961, and we've come a long way, where we're now using both FFA and ICG to study the retinal and choroidal vasculature and perfusion. So now this is an image of an FFA and an ICG. Choroidal vessels are not clearly delineated on FFA, whereas the fovea is not seen very well on the ICGA. Now, going a little bit into FFA, the indications are basically to assess disease activity and also to plan treatment. Initially, we have a red-free image. This helps us to detect autofluorescence, which is autoemission of light by lipofuscin as seen in optic nerve head drusen. Now, there are different phases of an angiography, and each one of them give us some or the other information. Now, this is a table that shows the different phases of the angiography and the important events that occur during each one of them, starting from the time of injection up to the late phase. Now, on to retina time, we tend to ignore most of the time, but it is extremely important because it gives us clues as to whether there is a cardiac disease, giant cell arteritis, and carotid artery stenosis as well. Now, the fovea on FFA is very distinct. It appears darker. This is because it is avascular and it is about 350 to 500 microns. It occurs due to a blockage of the background choroidal fluorescence by increased xanthophyll density and also larger RP cells with more melanin. As against this image, which shows macular ischemia, which could be the reason for unexplained vision loss or no improvement despite adequate treatment. There is an enlarged FAZ and discontinuous rim of the FAZ as well. Now, the FFA interpretation, important things that we need to consider is the eye, the face of the FFA, the fluorescence and how it appears, the pathology, and how the pathology actually behaves with respect to time, whether there is intensity or there is increase in the size. Now, going on to hyperfluorescence, in the early phase, you can either see a window defect or a leakage. A window defect is basically an area of hyperfluorescence or where there is probably lack of pigmentation due to pathology and therefore causes increased visualization of fluorescence of the underlying choroid. Now, the window defect usually starts very early, remains uniform in size and fades without actually changing shape or size. As you can see in this image, you can see a window defect. Now, what is leakage? This is a patient with neovascularization. You can see increasing in intensity and size. Leakage basically results from a disruption of the inner and outer blood-retinal barrier, which is seen in neovascularization. And also, this is due to dysfunction in endothelial barriers, as you can see in macular edema. There is intense fluorescence seen in the early stages, and it progresses to increase in intensity and size. Now, the other hyperfluorescence that we see is during the late phase. It could either be due to pooling or due to staining. Now, pooling is accumulation of dye within a distinct anatomical space, and it is again due to breakdown of the blood-retinal barrier. This is a patient with CSCR where you can see pooling, and also it is seen in patients with PEDs. Now, in CSCR, you can see increasing in the size and intensity, whereas with the PEDs, there is no increase in the size. Another hyperfluorescence that we can see is staining, which is due to accumulation of fluorescent dye into certain tissues, and this is seen in the mid to late phase with no change in size over time. You can see it in patients with drusen and chorioretinal scars. Hypofluorescence can either be due to blocked fluorescence or vascular filling defect. Here, there is basically an optical obstruction of normal fluorescence. It could be due to pre-retinal lesions, intraretinal, subretinal, and even sub-RP or choroidal lesions. This is basically because increase in pigmentation or due to hemorrhage as well. You can also see a vascular filling defect. It could be due to non-filling of retinal arterioles, either due to anatomical or physiological causes. This is an example wherein there is a blockage due to a hemorrhage that is seen pre-retinal. Now, going on to some case examples, here there is arterial occlusion. You can clearly see non-filling and therefore hypofluorescence. And another example of central serous chorioretinopathy, where you're seeing pinpoint hypofluorescence in the early stage, which spreads circumferentially in all directions with increase in intensity. This is the classic ink blot appearance. Now, another very classic pattern of CSCR is a smokestack appearance, in which we see a pinpoint hypofluorescence in the early phase, and it ascends vertically up to the highest peak of the neurosensory detachment and then plumes laterally like an umbrella or mushroom, giving the typical appearance. Some examples of CNVMs. Here, initially we see a stippled hypofluorescence, which increases in intensity in the later phases. Another early well-defined lacy pattern of leakage can also be seen, which again increases in intensity as the different phases of FFA progress. BRVO, a typical example here, where also there is neovascularization of the disc. You can see it increases in intensity. You can see a large area of non-perfusion as well. Advanced PDR, you can see block fluorescence due to a boat-shaped hemorrhage. You can also see pinpoint hypofluorescence due to microaneurysms. You can see neovascularizations, which are increasing in intensity and side in the late phases. This is a patient with vasculitis, which showed both neovascularization, which is leaking, and also capillary non-perfusion areas. Choroiditis, important here is that we see early hypofluorescence and late hypofluorescence as the stage progresses. So fluorescent angiography is a standard tool for dynamic studies of retinal circulation and is still now the gold standard. But it does have limitations viewing the choroidal circulation, which is why we need the ICGA. The important advantages of ICGA is that it helps studying choroidal vasculature, which could be prevented in FFA due to RP blockage. These are all the advantages and how it overcomes the limitations of FFA. Going on to the different phases of the ICGA, important here is the watershed zone that you can see in image A. You have the early phase, the early mid phase, the late mid phase, and the late phase, which can go on from 14 minutes to 45 minutes. You can see hyperfluorescent choroidal vessels and gradual fading of the diffuse hyperfluorescence that we saw in the early phases. Some of the conditions that for which ICGA are important is AMD, CSCR, PCV, choroidal inflammatory diseases, and choroidal tumors. Coming quickly to some case examples, especially PCV is very evident on ICG. Typical occult leak is seen on FFA, but you can see choroidal, the polyps and the Pachy vessels on ICGA here. Diffuse lake leak generally obscures details on FFA. Another example of PCV on ICGA, you can see a large hemorrhagic PED with SRF and Pachy vessels and double layer sign on the OCT. You see an occult leakage on FFA, but on ICG, very clearly you can see polyps and the BVN. Dynamic ICG is something that shows continuous flow of dye, useful in monitoring feeder vessels, and wrapped lesions can be diagnosed using dynamic ICG. Now, VKH syndrome, important, like I mentioned, some inflammatory conditions also ICGA is useful. Here is one example where you can see these hyperfluorescent spots. You can also see choroidal vessel hyperfluorescence and leakage of VKH. Choroidal tumors show increasing hyperfluorescence detected after injection. Of note, the margins of the tumors appear scalloped on ICGA, and the late phase shows hyperfluorescence within the tumor called as the washout effect. So is there a scope for non-invasive ICG like we have OCTA for FFA? Yes. So you can see here an example of conventional ICG versus the swept source OCTA on-fast choroidal vasculography. The benefit of using deeper penetration of 1050 nanometer wavelength as well as the very dense data contained in the 512 by 512 scans is quite evident here in a patient with CSCR and a secondary CNV. To quickly summarize The advantages of Octa over FFA. Octa can be acquired in a few seconds. Follow-up scans are very possible here. Does not require an intravenous injection of the dye. Hence, the adverse effects can be very well avoided. CNP and NVs can be precisely measured. The 3D nature gives us several benefits, and you can see both retinal and choroidal circulations. Whereas the dye-based angiography requires multiple image frames taken over several minutes. Nausea, vomiting, anaphylaxis are common. Dye leakage can obscure pathology, and it's 2D, so therefore it cannot basically distinguish vascular abnormalities within the different layers. So this was a quick overview of the advantages of FFA and ICG in retina practice. Of course, there's a lot more that needs to be studied. And thank you so much for this opportunity again.
Hello everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank COS and VRSI for giving me this opportunity. In the coming few minutes, I would be speaking to you on the common causes of poor visual outcome after cataract surgery and how to improve the patient satisfaction. So the pre-op evaluation in any cataract patient is of extreme importance. We have to spend a few minutes to take the history of diabetes, hypertension, and stroke, which can all have an impact on the final visual outcome. We must correlate the grade of the cataract with the BCVA in both the eyes. And if the grade of the cataract is same in both the eyes, but the vision is poorer in one eye, then we must suspect that there could be an underlying retinal pathology. We must assess the pupillary responses and rule out a relative afferent pupillary defect. A detailed slit lamp biomicroscopy and optical coherence tomography in today's time is of extreme importance. The common causes of poor vision are diabetic macular edema, age-related macular degeneration, epiretinal membrane vitreomacular traction, a macular hole, and cystoid macular edema. So these are the common causes which need to be ruled out when we plan a cataract surgery in a patient. Now coming to diabetic retinopathy and diabetic macular edema. The patient has to be treated as a whole and not just the eye or the cataract. We must evaluate the patient for his metabolic control. HbA1c is relevant for the incidence of diabetic macular edema, and therefore it should be well controlled prior to any cataract surgery. So if we have a patient who has both diabetes and cataract, and in that patient, if there is no evidence of diabetic retinopathy, we can very well go ahead and plan the cataract surgery without any change in the visual prognosis. If we are also dealing with a patient with NPDR with no evidence of diabetic macular edema, there would again be no impact on the visual outcome. But if we have a patient of diabetic macular edema and cataract, then we have to assess the patient on an optical coherence tomography. If the subcentral subfield thickness is more than 400 microns, it's preferable that we treat the diabetic macular edema first, followed by the cataract surgery. However, if it is borderline, then we can also opt for a combined cataract surgery along with anti-VEGF or a steroid injection. But if we have a patient with PDR, then it's preferable again to do a panretinal photocoagulation if the visibility is enough, and then plan a combined cataract surgery and an anti-VEGF injection if required. So post-operatively in these patients, we have to continue using the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory eye drops for a little longer time because of the risk of increase in macular edema. We must emphasize to the patient regarding the metabolic control on every visit. So this is one of my patients who was a 50-year-old male patient, a known diabetic with NS2 grade cataract in both the eyes. But what I found that the vision was far less in the right eye, and which did not correlate very much to the grade of the cataract that was present. This patient also had a deranged lipid profile, so he was started on atorvastatin 20 mg by our physician. So this is how his macula looked on an OCT, where you had this deposit in the subfoveal space. We gave one injection of anti-VEGF, which drastically improved the vision to 6/18 N9. And subsequent to this, the patient underwent a cataract surgery, which improved the vision to 6/9 and N6. So if we would have just done a cataract surgery in this patient, probably he would not have been as happy as he was, where his edema was taken care first, followed by the cataract surgery. Now, coming to the second common macular pathology is the age-related macular degeneration. The patient is going to be having symptoms such as metamorphopsia, a scotoma, a diminution of vision, the loss of contrast, and also the missing of the letters. The vision again is not going to be correlating with the grade of the cataract that is going to be present. And these are the various things that we can pick up on doing a slit lamp biomicroscopy. We can see extensive subretinal hemorrhage. We can see some amount of subretinal fluid in the macular area. We can pick up the drusens. And sometimes we can also see the choroidal neovascular membrane. So we should make best use of the various imaging modalities which are present, which is going to help us pick up a pathology like AMD, which can greatly have an impact on the final visual outcome after the cataract surgery. So if you're dealing with a patient with cataract and an active CNVM, which you can pick up by seeing various signs such as subretinal fluid, intraretinal fluid, or a subretinal hemorrhage, then it is best to treat these patients first with anti-VEGF injections and then plan a cataract surgery after the lesion has completely dried out. But if you are dealing with a patient where the cataract is so significant that you cannot really monitor the patient, then it is best to do a combined cataract surgery along with an anti-VEGF injection. However, you have to remember that the treatment with anti-VEGF injections is going to continue even after the cataract surgery. Now, coming to another common macular pathology, which is a macular hole. So on clinical examination, the patient is going to present with diminution of vision, a scotoma, or a metamorphopsia. You can see the macular hole on an OCT of the macula. Now, if you're dealing with a patient of cataract and a full thickness macular hole, there are various options which are available with us. This is one of my patients who had a visual acuity of 660 N36. He had a post-traumatic cataract. You see a large choroidal tear passing through the macular area. You have a full thickness macular hole. And what we wanted to assess was that whether this choroidal tear is passing through the macular hole or not, because it's going to greatly change the visual prognosis. So we did a fundus autofluorescence, which shows that the choroidal tear is just passing through the edge, but is not passing through the base of the macular hole. So we planned a macular hole surgery combined with a cataract surgery in this patient. The ILM was stained with a brilliant blue-green dye. And this was then followed by the pinch and the peel technique using an ILM forceps. Various flaps of the ILM, they were raised and they were inverted over the macular hole. And this process was followed 360 degree all around the full thickness macular hole. The peeling of the ILM was further enlarged using the ILM forceps. And this was followed by the fluid air exchange, followed by the gas tamponade. And we see that the vision drastically improved to 618 N12 with a type 1 closure of the macular hole. Now we're coming to the epiretinal membrane or a vitreomacular traction. Again, the patient is going to be complaining of metamorphopsia and diminution of vision. What we can appreciate on the slit lamp biomicroscopy is the dragging of the macula and the distortion of the blood vessels. Again, in this patient, we planned a combined cataract surgery with the removal of this thick epiretinal membrane. The pre-op vision was 636 N36, which did not correlate with the grade of the cataract that was present in this patient. And what we find after a combined surgery, that the vision had improved to 612 N18. My last common pathology would be a cystoid macular edema. Again, this is going to cause a diminution of vision in the patient. The patient will give the history that he was seeing good after the surgery, but then it started falling down. Patient can also have metamorphopsia. Now, there can be various causes of cystoid macular edema. It could be post-operative, it could be inflammatory, secondary to pars planitis. It could be secondary to vascular pathologies, such as diabetic retinopathy, retinal vein occlusion, retinitis pigmentosa, and a type 3 CNVM. This is what we see on a fundus fluorescein angiography, where we have a petaloid appearance of hyperfluorescence. On optical coherence tomography, we have the cystoid spaces which are going to be present. The treatment, of course, is going to depend on the underlying cause in these patients. So I would like to end by saying that early recognition of any macular disorder is crucial to prognosticate a patient of cataract. The decision to operate the cataract is major, and one needs to be sure that the diminution of vision is due to cataract alone, or it is due to some other combined reason which is underlying. The retina diagnostics, they greatly help in today's time in confirming the diagnosis. We should either treat the comorbidity before the cataract surgery, for example, diabetic macular edema, or plan a combined management such as a cataract and a macular hole surgery. And we must discuss in detail the visual prognosis with the patient, plan for a cataract surgery before the patient feels disappointed after having not gained the vision that he was expecting after the cataract surgery. Thank you so much for your patient listening.